The Louisiana State Penitentiary, known as Angola, sits on 18,000 acres of former plantation land along the Mississippi River. It is the largest maximum security prison in the United States. It holds men serving long sentences, including life without parole. For decades, Angola carries a reputation for extreme violence, tight internal control, and limited outside oversight. Within that environment, a disturbing allegation emerges. Some prisoners, former staff, lawyers, and investigators claim that violence inside the prison is not always spontaneous. They allege it is sometimes directed. If stories like this matter to you, consider subscribing, because what happens next reveals how this system truly works. The allegation centers on what critics describe as inmate death squads. According to these claims, certain prisoners are allowed or encouraged to attack other inmates. The targets are often labeled troublemakers, informants, or men who file complaints. The alleged attackers are said to receive protection, privileges, or leniency in return. The charge is not that every killing is ordered, but that some violence is tolerated as a tool of control. The question raised is simple and unsettling. When prison staff allow lethal violence to enforce order, who is responsible for the deaths that follow? Angola's history provides the backdrop. For much of the 20th century, the prison operates with minimal external scrutiny. Guards oversee vast cell blocks with limited staffing. Armed inmate trustees, known historically as trusties, once patrol the grounds. This system officially ends in the early 1970s after federal court rulings declare it unconstitutional. But critics argue that informal versions of inmate enforcement persist long after the formal policy disappears. In the 1970s and 1980s, Angola records some of the highest inmate homicide rates in the country. Men are stabbed in dormitories, beaten in fields, or found dead under unclear circumstances. Official explanations often cite inmate-on-inmate violence. Families of the dead are told little. Internal reports are brief. Prosecutions are rare. This pattern draws the attention of civil rights attorneys and advocacy groups. Several lawsuits filed in federal court describe similar claims. Plaintiffs allege that prison officials know certain inmates routinely carry out assaults. They claim guards fail to intervene, fail to report threats, and sometimes move potential victims into danger. In sworn complaints, some prisoners state that refusing to participate in violence brings consequences. These include loss of work assignments, disciplinary write-ups, or placement in more dangerous housing. One of the most frequently cited issues is classification. In Angola, housing assignments determine survival. Critics argue that officials place vulnerable inmates in open dorms with known violent offenders. When attacks occur, the prison describes them as unpredictable. Lawsuits challenge that narrative. They argue that warning signs exist and are ignored. Whistleblower accounts play a key role in shaping the controversy. Former inmates who later testify in court describe systems of favoritism. They claim certain prisoners are allowed weapons, movement, or authority beyond the rules. In exchange, they are expected to handle problems. These accounts appear in depositions, affidavits, and investigative journalism. They are contested by prison officials, but they persist across decades. The most serious allegations arise when multiple deaths follow similar patterns. In several cases, inmates are killed shortly after conflicts with staff or after filing grievances. Civil complaints point out timing, housing changes, and prior threats. They argue these deaths are foreseeable. In some instances, witnesses later recant or refuse to testify. Fear of retaliation is a recurring theme. Retaliation inside a closed institution is difficult to prove. But records show that witnesses in prison homicide cases often request protective custody. Some are transferred. Others disappear from case files entirely. When prosecutions fail, families are left without answers. Civil litigation becomes the primary avenue for accountability. Investigative journalists begin to examine Angola more closely in the 1990s. Reports describe a culture of silence. Guards rarely testify against one another. Inmate testimony is dismissed as unreliable. Physical evidence goes missing or is inadequately preserved. Autopsies note blunt force trauma or stab wounds but provide little context. The official conclusion remains inmate violence. The administration disputes the death squad narrative. Officials state that Angola houses extremely violent offenders. They argue that limited staffing and old infrastructure make prevention difficult. They deny directing inmates to kill. They deny granting permission. They emphasize reforms, including increased education programs and religious outreach. They argue that violence declines over time. Statistics do show a reduction in reported homicides by the late 1990s and early 2000s. But critics argue that numbers alone do not answer structural questions. They ask whether earlier deaths are properly investigated. They ask whether reforms address past misconduct or simply rebrand the institution. The role of the courts becomes central. Federal judges reviewing conditions at Angola express concern about safety and supervision. Consent decrees require changes in classification, staffing, and use of force reporting. These orders acknowledge a pattern of harm without explicitly endorsing the death squad label. Still, they validate claims that the prison fails to protect inmates. Some of the most detailed accounts come from civil discovery. Internal memos, incident reports, and depositions reveal gaps between policy and practice. In some cases, guards admit knowing which inmates are violent. They admit using them as informal enforcers to maintain order. They deny encouraging murder. The line between awareness and approval becomes blurred. A recurring issue is accountability. When an inmate kills another inmate, the investigation is often handled internally. Criminal charges are uncommon. When they occur, they rely heavily on inmate witnesses. Without corroboration, cases collapse. Prosecutors defer to prison officials. This creates a closed loop. Violence is framed as unavoidable, and oversight remains minimal. Families of victims attempt to pierce that loop. They file wrongful death suits. They demand records. They seek independent investigations. Many cases settle without admission of wrongdoing. Others are dismissed on procedural grounds. The underlying allegations remain unresolved. Advocacy groups use Angola as a case study in broader critiques of American incarceration. They argue that extreme sentences and overcrowding create conditions where informal violence flourishes. They argue that staff shortages incentivize reliance on inmate control. Angola becomes an example of what happens when management substitutes fear for supervision. Former wardens publicly reject the death squad characterization. They point to reductions in violence and national recognition for rehabilitation programs. They argue that past abuses belong to an earlier era. Critics respond that reforms do not erase uninvestigated deaths. They argue that transparency, not public relations, determines credibility. The fear that discourages witnesses remains a constant. In court filings, inmates describe threats, beatings, and social isolation after speaking out. Some request transfers out of Angola entirely. Others withdraw complaints. Judges acknowledge the risk but note the limits of judicial reach inside prisons. The Department of Justice periodically reviews conditions at Louisiana prisons. Reports cite concerns about use of force, supervision, and reporting practices. They stop short of confirming organized death squads. But they note patterns consistent with tolerance of violence. These findings fuel continued scrutiny. The phrase death squad itself becomes controversial. Supporters say it captures the reality of delegated violence. Opponents say it exaggerates and obscures complexity. What remains undisputed is that Angola records a history of inmate deaths under circumstances that raise serious questions. The mechanisms of control are opaque. Responsibility is diffused. As years pass, evidence becomes harder to recover. Witnesses age. Records are lost. Statutes of limitation expire. The possibility of criminal accountability fades. The historical record relies on lawsuits, journalism, and fragmented testimony. The truth remains contested, but the pattern is documented. The core issue is not whether every allegation is proven. The issue is whether a prison can allow known violent actors to operate unchecked. Federal law requires prisons to protect those in custody. Failure to do so is not an accident. It is a policy outcome. Angola continues to operate. Men continue to live and die behind its fences. Official narratives emphasize stability. Critics emphasize unresolved deaths. The institution's size and isolation make definitive answers rare. But the allegations persist because the conditions that produced them are real. When violence becomes a management strategy, formal rules lose meaning. Authority shifts from law to fear. In that environment, accountability dissolves. Whether labeled death squads or something less explicit, the result is the same. Lives are lost without clear responsibility. The Angola controversy forces a broader question about incarceration in the United States. Who truly controls prisons when oversight is limited and populations are warehoused for life? The answer determines whether custody remains lawful or crosses into complicity. The story does not end with a verdict. It ends with a record. A record of deaths, allegations, and unanswered questions. A record that challenges official assurances. A record that remains relevant as long as prisons operate in secrecy. If you think this story was intense, the next one will leave you speechless. Subscribe for more true crime stories that'll keep you on the edge of your seat.